We have a look at the Inequality Trends Report that was released by Stats SA last week.
South Africa continues to be one of the most unequal societies in the world. The latest Inequality Trends reports from Stats SA show that since 1994, we're still struggling to bridge a gap between racial and gender groups. Black people continue to lag behind white people in other races, basically in all of them. The indicators, for example, show that black families are earning just under 7,000 Rand on average, while white families are earning just below 25,000 Rand per month. The report also looks at the gender inequality and has found that women earn about a third less on average than men, and they are less likely to be employed. So joining us now is a good friend of the show, Dr. Jason Musioka, a developmental economist and associate researcher at the University of Pretoria. Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Musioka.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the numbers coming out of last week, no surprises there, but quite interesting is how we've now categorized inequality in the country. So speaking of people who are chronically poor, and in this country overwhelmingly being black and colored people, people who are transiently poor, but I'm quite interested in the quite high number of chronically poor people. How do we make sense of that? Is it that these are people who are born into poverty and simply cannot get out of poverty in their lifetime? How do we make sense of what sounds like quite a serious categorization?
Right. So I think the chronically poor is a measure that we use when we're trying to look at the question of inequality in particular. And the chronically poor are essentially those who are locked in poverty, and they don't get in and out of poverty. The transient poor are those, for example, there are some episodes where you get employed, you have some income, then you lose a job. Those are the transient poor, where at some point you have experienced some form of poverty in one way or another. The chronically poor are permanently locked in poverty, and as you rightly point out, given the structural nature of poverty in South Africa, the chronically poor tend to be intergenerationally poor. So you have generations of poverty running from probably the 3-4 generations, and they're locked in poverty for quite a long time, over generations.
So one of the things, sorry, Caesar, one of the things we kind of told as our good story was that we'd managed to lift people out of poverty, right? So certainly extreme poverty. It's a story around the world that we've done well with reducing extreme poverty. What we can't seem to get right is get people out of having money but not enough to live. So even people who are so-called middle class, for all intents and purposes, cannot afford to live. How do we go about fixing that? Also considering, I think South Africa is quite an extreme example, but we're seeing it in other parts of the world. We've dealt with extreme poverty. We just can't deal with people having money but not enough. The so-called working poor is one of the phrases that we use to describe this phenomenon.
So I think you're absolutely correct that by and large we've seen reduced levels of poverty the world over, and in South Africa as well. If you look at the figures from 1994 to now, we have reduced poverty quite significantly. But I think the bigger question is where we have not dealt with the question of inequality. And keep in mind that even when we reduce poverty, we still have rising cost of living. And what then happens is that you have, especially the top 1%, both globally and in South Africa, who gain more profits, and there is much more income that they get from their capital investments and so on. And so they are able to afford the rising cost of living. And those that we've lifted out of poverty, they are just above the poverty line, but they are not necessarily able to have a livable life that's really out of rather a much more, out of such a dramatic trap of poverty. Yeah.
And so then how do you deal with that?
I think one of the key problems that we have in South Africa, for me, the one thing is the analysis. What we have done in South Africa, we've followed the same trend that the rest of the world does in terms of trying to understand our poverty and our inequality. I think South Africa's poverty and inequality are significantly different. And it has been argued that it is structural in the sense that not many countries will have up to 4 or 5 generations locked in poverty. Usually, and I'll give you an example of the global recession, what happened in most European nations and the United States, is that you had unemployment rate and some levels of poverty that arose out of the global recession. But that was because of unemployment. And the United States was sitting at about 10% unemployment, for example, in 2008, and in just about 5 years, they came back to 4%. In South Africa, we were 21% unemployed people in 1994. We're sitting at 29.4%. We're going the other way around. And the problem is that the kind of poverty that we have is much more structural, much more deep. And when we make policies that look at, for example, if you are poor, we will give you a chicken project and so on, we are scratching the surface. We are not dealing with the intergenerational poverty that goes back to lack of education by your grandfathers and so on. And that, for me, the analysis is a key problem that I think we perhaps need to look at much more innovative ways of understanding the nature of poverty there is in South Africa. And I think from a proper diagnosis, this is like cancer. If you diagnose cancer in the wrong way, you give wrong medication, you get the wrong outcome. And that's my assessment. That's very critical for me.
Thank you very much for joining us, Jason. Obviously, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Dr. Jason Musiaka, the development economist, just joining us on the show.